Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Uncensored CMO. In this episode, I'm joined by the most returned guest ever. Yes, that's right, it's Orlando Wood, Chief Innovation Officer at System One and author of not one but two IPA best-selling books, Lemon and Lookout. If you haven't read them, go and order them. They are genuinely fantastic. I wanted to catch up with Orlando because he's been a very busy guy. He's up to a lot of things at the moment. He's got his eye on a course. He's preparing some new research for F-Work later in the year. And we also wanted to just chat about ads because that's fun. And there's been quite a few ads recently that we got an opinion about. And we thought we'd deconstruct them and find out why they work. So this is a great episode. A lot of fun catching up with my old mate Orlando. Here it is. I have got a returning guest. In fact, I've got the most returned guest of guests joining me in this episode, Mr. Orlando Wood.
Hello, John. Good to be back. Where's the merch, by the way?
I know. We were chatting about this before, weren't we? I need to do better on the merch front, don't I? So this is one of my objectives, I think, in the next quarter.
But you are in a studio. It's my first
you
time
haven't been in the studio before. I know.
No.
I know.
It's
Exactly. What do you think?
You're on the up.
It's grey.
Yeah.
Which is so that we can look at you rather than the background. You see, that's the whole idea. Yeah. Now, for those that don't know you, which is probably about two people listening, because anyone who's listened to a few episodes would have picked you up. Yeah. Who are you? What do you do?
Who am I?
And why are you here? Right. We'll start with a few easy questions.
I'm Orlando Wood, and I have written a couple of books on advertising effectiveness, on the creative itself, and what kind of creative works. Generates market share gain, profit gain, sales gain. And I've worked with the IPA and the IPA's effectiveness database. I've worked with Peter Field, Karen Nelson Field. I work at System One. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer there, and I am honorary fellow of the IPA. So I guess my job is to look at what makes for great advertising.
Oh, fantastic. You'll also be pleased to know, I did ask ChatGPT, who is Orlando Wood? That's right. And you got a fairly good write-up, I have to say.
Did I?
Well,
it was referring to me, was it?
It referred to you. And apparently you've demonstrated the power of emotion to make advertising that works.
Gosh.
I thought it was pretty
knowing.
good.
Yeah.
I did try John Evans about 15 times. And I just got this statement. So as of September 2021, the algorithm does not pick up any reference to John Evans.
You're kidding.
So anyway, no, apparently not.
You're kidding.
Or the uncensored CMO.
You're kidding.
No, exactly. I did try many prompts. Anyway, there we go. So what I do in my spare time.
I'm very surprised by that.
So listen, we caught up last time in Cannes, but what have you been up to recently?
Well, at the moment, I'm preparing for some new research to be revealed at the IPA's F-Works conference in October, looking at digital platforms and formats and how to create mental availability in those, using those channels and platforms. So that's going to be quite an interesting one to look out for. And I've also been, thinking about preparing a new creative effectiveness course, which I'm working on at the moment, which I'm very excited about. And it should, a series of films for marketing teams who are interested in getting the most, squeezing the most out of their advertising.
Very good. Well, listen, I'd love to come back to that because that sounds fascinating, and congratulations on setting that up. But first, let's talk about, is 2023 the year Orlando went digital? Because I've pretty much only heard you talk about digital over the last few months.
Yeah, no. Well, I've talked a lot about television advertising, but I think that's slightly harsh, John. I mean, I have in my book, Look Out. I did talk about how to generate, market share gain and these big, broad and lasting effects using online video. But we've long known, the difference between a TV ad, a print ad, and a poster, and how to, I suppose, create good work in those sorts of channels. But it just seems to me that in the last 15 years or so, there's been a proliferation of new formats and platforms, and we're still trying to get to grips with, how we create brand building work on those channels. What's the stage for our brand building show? Mm. And also, what does the show look like on those different stages?
Well, exactly. I think that's the thing, isn't it? Because we have been quite binary about it, haven't we? We've TV is brand building medium, and digital is activation where people go to buy.
And that's typically
and
how it has been used.
That's how it's been used. And we've fallen into trap of only believing that either only does that one thing. But actually, of course, they do elements of both to varying degrees. So what does the research tell you about the ability of, let's say, digital channels to build brands?
Well, they can, and they do it in the way that, you know, you might use TV in the sense that, you know, if you can create an emotional response, you can create mental availability. There's this link between advertising that makes people feel something and its ability to lodge in memory and to create mental availability, which of course leads to, you know, growth. And that's that link you see not just in TV, but you see it in other channels too. I've done work with Meta to show that. We've done work recently with Pinterest to show that. So we're looking at, you know, how this principle holds. But the other thing it's worth talking about is the scale of the effect. You know, the degree to which you can expect to see those improvements. And that's where I suppose the work I've been doing with Karen Nelson Field, Rob Britton, Peter Field comes in, looking at the I suppose isolating the effect of the attention that media gets, as well as the creative strength, and that really you to get the biggest bang for your buck, you need high attention media together with highly emotive advertising, and you need to be investing in, you know, your advertising above your size if you can, you know, that extra share of voice. So that was one of the things I was talking about.
Well, I think that's one of the most important principles. I mean, we're all very familiar with excess share of voice and how that drives market share. But if you're not putting very good creative or not using very good creative for that share of voice, then you know, it's going to be wasted. Equally, if you've got really good creative, you can take that excess share of voice, can do more for you than it would otherwise do.
And that's what we were saying at Cannes. You know, we were looking at, you know, you've got if you look at campaigns which have poor emotive strength, low attention media, and negative extra share of voice, you're not going to achieve very much. If you improve your creative, that will get you a bit further in terms of the effects that you see. But still, if you're using low attention media and not investing enough, you're not going to be really where you want to be. What you really want, of course, ideally, is the triple opportunity we were talking about, which was emotive advertising, high attention media, and positive extra share of voice.
Yeah, so very much medium and message being both important. And before we move on, if you can, what are the ways in which advertisers can achieve an effective message? So what would you advise advertisers to do to achieve that? Because I think a lot of people listening might have grown up in the kind of social media world where, you know, things are very quick and fast paced and cut down and so on. But how do you create the kind of work that captures attention?
You know, what I try and do in my books and in my work is look at the style, how different styles of advertising create different types of effect and different scales of effect. So an ad which, you know, we might recognize as being a performance ad, which is quite rhythmic, quite mechanistic, words on the screen, no sense of live time, just short, sharp cuts, probably quite self-conscious in the way that it looks and feels. You know, that's going to work most likely on those people who are already primed to like the brand or who are in the buying decision mode in that window. It's not going to work because it's largely very uninteresting if you're not either of those things on a broader population. So what you need to create growth over a longer period and lasting growth is advertising that assumes no inherent interest in the brand or product, but creates interest in the brand or product, lodges it in the memory. And that's achieved, as I've shown, through advertising that involves the living, people, movement, a sense of lived time, dialogue, betweenness, so like us here now, you know, people talking to each other, character, incident and place, as I described, music. Those sorts of things create an emotional response. They also capture and hold our attention better than that sort of mechanistic advertising. And they're going to lodge your brand in memory better. And it all, you know, research was inspired by the brilliant work of a scientist, Ian McGilchrist, who talks about the two halves of the brain and the different types of attention associated with
I do want to talk about this. I do, because I've actually been listening to his audio book, so we'll get into this. But just before we do, you even came up with a new tagline to describe what you're talking about. Can you tell us what that was?
What do you mean? Which tagline?
Moto azione. Which tagline? Orlando, this was the pinnacle of your cantor.
No, well, it was. Sorry.
Let me remind you.
Yeah, thanks for the prompt. Moto azione. Sì. So moto azione is something I talked about at Cannes, and it refers to the actually something that 17th century Italian artists and sculptors talked about, which was the way in which, I mean, it means moto as in to move, for movere, and azione is action. So it's the sort of emotion expressed through the body and face at an emotional turning point in the action. And if you look at art from that period, you see that it's like stills from a film, you know, the most emotive moment, you know, the boy being bitten by a lizard, you know, that sort of thing. And actually, it tells us a lot about what works in advertising. And a certain kind of advertising, you know, brand building advertising that lodges in the memory, that creates both present and future earnings, by the way, is the sort of advertising that involves people connecting movement and that sense of a turning point. You know, our hero's luck is changing, perhaps. And that sense of suspense, action and resolution is, you know, something that ad agencies, particularly in the 70s and 80s here in the UK, I think really intuitively understood. And I talk about CDP in particular, Collett Dickinson Pierce, who were masters at this. If you think about some of the ads that they made, like Heineken refreshes the parts, well, that was pursued later on by you know, the offshoot Howard Spink, and then also, you know, you've got the Hamlet cigars with the sort of change in the face and expressions, and then the sort of happiness is a cigar called Hamlet. So that movement in the face and body is really important for holding attention.
Now, you mentioned Ian McGilchrist, and as I was saying to you, actually, in fact, I remember pretty much after we first met, you suddenly came over with this enormous book and just said,
well, he's written another now.
This changes everything. I remember you were deeply struck, weren't you, by the master and his emissary and how profound it was. Yeah. And what you've done, I think, uniquely is applied that body of work to advertising. And I say, you know, me as someone who's kind of consuming it from you, it really does change how you see advertising. It's almost like
the world and the people
and the world. Yeah. It's almost like looking under the bonnet and going, oh right, that's how this works then, kind of thing. And I say I'm just listening to the audio version of it now, and it's just fascinating. And it you know, I mean, people probably say this too much, but it does change how you see the world. You know, it really does. So for anyone which I imagine most people haven't read yet, the full books, it's quite you know, prolific. Yes. Can you describe what Ian McGilchrist has done through his research and why that book in particular and his work is so profound when it comes to advertising?
And it's, you know, I mean, do read it yourselves because it you know, it's difficult to do it just.
Well, I tell you what, like, no worry about it. If you listen to the audiobook, right, it's 2 hours of introductions, caveats, context, background before you get into the book itself, right? But even those 2 hours are really interesting, because he basically talks about what you can and can't conclude, and that, you know, for a scientist that's so precise, the amount that he says is still yet unknown, or you have to take this in context, or, you know, it's not as absolute as you get told. But, you know, one of the things he starts off with is the popular myth that the left and right brain do different things, which has been debunked a long time ago. But what I found fascinating is he talks about how that's actually held back the whole research of the brain, because people have gone, well, we're not going to look at hemisphere and how it works because of this.
That's right.
But actually, he's discovered it's not that they do different things; they do things in different ways.
They do things differently, and different takes on the world, different priorities, and different modes of attention, which should be of interest to anyone in working in advertising. And he talks about, I mean, the two hemispheres, first of all, are quite different in their way that they're put together, if you like. The left hemisphere prioritizes information within transmission within localized brain region, whereas the right hemisphere's got more branching, more overlap. It's bigger and heavier than the left hemisphere. It's got more myelin. That's the white matter that helps to speed transition. So it's more associative in the way that it passes things around, And he talks about this not just in people, but in other animals, in birds, and how these two hemispheres, they're quite separate. They're bridged in the middle, but they're really quite separate things. And the left hemisphere likes to it has this sort of narrow beam attention, which looks very close up at things, and likes to abstract things from its context, break things down to smaller parts. So if you think of a bird pecking around on the ground, it's the left hemisphere controlling the right eye that takes the worm or the grub from its context and identifies it, categorizes it. Oh, it's one of those, it's okay to eat. That's what the left hemisphere likes doing, and same in people. Now, the right hemisphere is all the while using the left eye to look around it and make sure that it's vigilant for things that might be a threat, or there might be a mate out there, So it's largely looking around for social context and trying to understand, make sure it doesn't become someone else's lunch, probably. So that sort of holds in people too, but Ian's work, goes into much greater depth than that. And he talks about the left hemisphere being, and this is quite interesting, it's more susceptible or relies more on dopamine, the hormone, which is all about seeking and reward and that sort of goal orientation. Whereas the right hemisphere is more susceptible to noradrenaline, which is the hormone that's all about vigilance and broad awareness, but also the formation and retrieval of memories. So you've got these quite different brain habits just right there, So the left hemisphere is very goal orientated. It likes to break things down to smaller parts. It likes to categorize. It can't really understand lived time, only snapshots, if you like. It likes things to be fixed, repeatable, unchanging, so that it can control and manipulate them. And it also can't really understand music, only very basic rhythm, likes tools with which to manipulate the world. And language is one of these, signs, symbols, these are all things of the left hemisphere. But the right hemisphere, all the while, which presents the world to us and offers up, sort of prioritizes things for the left hemisphere to look at, has this broad beam attention that's open to social context, to the living, to things that are happening just slightly off stage, just sort of the edge of our awareness, if you like. And it's interested in people, intonation, expression, more intimately involved in expression and understanding of emotion through the body. So it understands body language and, the context of any given room. And it's really understanding of things on two levels as well. Metaphor and humour, tells the difference between a joke and a lie. The left hemisphere can't do that very well. And things to do with lived time, space and depth and music, all to do with the right hemisphere. So if you kind of start to understand these things and the habits of thinking of the two hemispheres, and you think about the two types of advertising I was describing not long ago, actually the two hemispheres map quite neatly onto these two styles of advertising that have developed over time. One that's broad beam and broad reach, how do we attract the attention of people who are maybe not in the buying mode right now, but lodge it in memory? Well, through right brain kind of work, and that's people, dialogue, all those things. If you're in the buying mode, and the left hemisphere is also more intrinsically involved in sort of choice, then it's the left hemisphere sort of advertising, performance advertising, that will nudge you towards a purchase at the right time, assuming you've been primed to like the brand and you're in the buying moment. So those two, understanding the way those two hemispheres work and the type of attention associated gives us a really good starting point for understanding how advertising itself works, how to get the most
It
out
really
of it.
does. And we talked about going back to the 70s and 80s and some of the famous work there. What I noticed was interesting is how he talks about how much we use different parts of the brain reflects then, what we rely on. So he was kind of saying, if you use, because I think he was also saying that the left and right are both used all the time, but in different kind of percentages or whatever sort of thing. So, and he was saying if, use 1 to 100%, the left to 100% and the right to say 90%, it's not that you're going to get roughly that ratio. What happens is over time, you'll become dominant in a particular way of thinking.
It sort of strengthens the
it becomes like a muscle, doesn't it? Because
yeah.
I guess brains are lazy and therefore we do what's easiest for us. So you do see different modes becoming more dominant. And also I think, hence the name of his book, actually the left brain tries to control the right brain and dictates the right brain, hence the master of his hemisphere as an analogy sort of thing. So in your research, have you seen a trend with left and right brain advertising over time?
In both my books, Lemon and Look Out, I look at that trend and, looking at a snapshot of advertising going back 30 years, you can see this quite marked shift towards the left brain advertising, this narrow beam advertising from about 2006 onwards. And it's sort of been getting largely, more pronounced over the last 15 years or so. And that ties in with, what other people, Peter Field in particular, have shown about the loss of long-term efficiency or effectiveness in that same period. So you get this shift towards just very direct and narrow beam and attention advertising that doesn't work as well if it isn't accompanied by that broad beam brand building advertising.
How much of it do you think is driven by the platforms themselves? Because you're referencing back to 2006. The obvious correlation to draw is that that was really the start of social media becoming mobile devices becoming more sophisticated and social media becoming a serious kind of media. How much of it is that versus kind of general trends that we might see, or is it impossible to kind of
you can't totally pull them apart? But in the books I talk about this shift which I think, by the way, you see not just in advertising but in culture more broadly, this left brain dominance, in programming, in film. When you get left brain dominance, it's not a particularly happy time, generally speaking, because I think you can trace it, as I do and as Ian does, in other periods in history and in the art of other periods. It's to do with, I strongly believe, digitization and getting to grips with this new digital world. The left brain likes tools, and we're using the left brain increasingly, all of us, to work with these tools. And then, so as you say, habits of thinking start to form which are better suited to the left hemisphere. And, you get this sort of shift, and there's a cultural shift that's happened. For anyone who's, over 40 will have realized and seen this cultural shift happening very rapidly, actually, in the last 20 years. That leads to less humorous films being made and advertising, by the way, and a very marked change in style, and even just the way people talk and the literalness and the directness that you might see more today. So you get this shift, and that's it's probably, I suspect, strongly down to digital transformation. Yeah,
makes no sense. Now, something you talked about earlier is how the left and right brains regulate our attention, and they have different types of attention as well. And again, creative can have a big difference, can't it, in terms of how much attention is created through. I guess there's the attention that's created through the platform, which Karen Nelson Field does a brilliant job of revealing, which is quite profound. But the creative itself, actually, there's a huge difference, isn't there, or elasticity in the amount of attention that it might create.
And you get. So what Karen and I have both seen, I think, and talked about together, is that if you've got two, let's call it a left and a right brain ad, or and you put them both on the same low attention platform, there won't be that much difference in how much attention is afforded, to them. But if you put them on a high attention platform, the right brain ad will get much more attention than the left brain ad. The higher the inherent attention paid to a channel or a medium, the more likely your creative is going to work. Your right brain creative is going to work. So that you get that boost with a higher attention platform.
I think you've proven as well that it improves recall as well of the brand after exposure.
Yes, I mean, just simply the amount of attention that's paid to the medium itself can extend or improve mental availability. There's that link between the two that Karen points to. But when you layer in the creative as well, then that you need.
And what kind of difference are you talking about here? Like 2 or 3%, or 2 or 3 times a day? I mean, how big is that elasticity?
Yeah, I mean, the recent research we looked at, suggested that on those high attention platforms, a highly emotive ad is going to, give you 10, 20% more attention time, if you like. Much less so on the low attention platforms. But, emotion has a much greater role than simply just extending the attention paid to your advertising, because it helps to put it in memory, and it helps to lodge it in memory and to create that mental availability that we open by talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, really. I mean, we're all familiar with the ESOV idea, but the impact of your media choice and then the impact of your creative choice has a dramatic impact on that. So, I mean, either you can take the same investment and achieve much more actual share of voice, or with a smaller budget, you can achieve the same. But it's quite profound. It has quite profound impacts on.
It does, and that's one of the things we looked at our recent study using ACA effectiveness data. And by the way, we're doing a repeat in a few weeks' time for anyone who didn't catch us at Cannes.
Very good. In fact, your talk was incredibly popular and got some amazing feedback. I mean, for anyone that wants to tune in, do you have a date for that?
28th is what we're looking at for 28th of September. So
I will post out details. So keep you posted, as they say.
Fantastic.
One of the surprising things actually I spotted at Cannes was I think there's some evidence that humour might be making a comeback. What do you think? Have we passed peak purpose?
Peak purpose. Well, it may be.
Are we there yet?
It may be too early to put the bunting out. But,
yes.
But yeah, no, that was great, wasn't it? That one of the Grand Prix winners was that Apple spot. Which, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it was sort of the lizard that you think is dead, and the guy who's looking after it for his presumably friend. It's quite a lot of good storytelling within a short amount of time. Actually, is about sends a message about I'm sorry,
Leon's died,
and then suddenly Leon flips back and is alive. And he can delete the message before anyone sees it and any harm is done. But I think quite neat, way of doing. And this is something that Jeremy Bullmore used to say: is that if you're using humour, then it has to be bound up with the product. It's not a separate thing. Those two things have to go hand in hand. And it demonstrates the virtue of the product. I mean, it does it very neatly, So it's a humorous spot. It's conveying something about the product in a very short amount of time, and it looks quite different from a lot of the work that we've seen awarded, in recent years. So I take that as hopefully significance precedes momentum. We'll see more along those lines, because humour is a very effective creative approach.
And as I think you've documented in your book, the humour's been declining in terms of it being used in creatively award-winning campaigns, and purpose has been on the up.
Yes, it has.
So this year, interestingly, I think when we did the System 1 evaluation, we found a big drop in the number of winning campaigns that use purpose as a communication idea. In other words, where purpose is intrinsic to the product, there were just as many of those, which is great, of course, because you want purposeful work to succeed. But where purpose was being used as a creative idea, actually, there's a big drop in that, and more examples of humour.
Yeah,
which is good. Although I do contend, actually, I think humour could be a very good way of delivering purpose.
Well,
I think
it could be,
I think underutilised.
It tends to lead to quite worthy and unhuman,
overly serious,
But I think brands have done, Maltesers, I think, have done.
I love that campaign.
Nice job. On that.
Yeah. No, so if anyone doesn't know that one, that's the disabled girl that's chatting to her friends about her love life. It's very, very, very funny. Yeah. But the genius thing about that, and the reason I love it so much, is she's telling the joke.
Yes.
Right? And she's got the kind of power of the situation, hasn't she? And you kind of feel like you feel lots of empathy for her. Yeah. You very much feel her experience. But it's very funny, and it makes. But it helps you enter into her kind of experience.
Well, that's right,
and that's what humour does. It makes you kind of relate.
What humour does,
and breaks a barrier down.
I think again, Jeremy Bullmore said this, was that it creates a mood of acceptance. G.K. Chesterton, wonderful quote: "Humour can get in under the door while seriousness is still fumbling at the handle," and that's exactly
brilliant.
Right.
I love that's a very good quote. Very good quote. It does, and you've got another phrase similar to that, which I also like, is what's too silly to be said can be sung.
Yes.
Which I think I love. That is another good example of using music to.
Well, that's right. And actually, music and humour are in some ways conceptually similar. They're both about life. Humour is often about inversion, transposing something to a different key. Repetition. These are all concepts you get in music as well, that almost difficult to articulate, but that we kind of intuitively through the right hemisphere understand, but difficult to put into words, but we know it when we see it, type thing.
Now, I wanted to quickly ask about one of my favourite contributions of yours to kind of this whole world is Fluent devices. I think if I was to start out on a new brand tomorrow and, create a new campaign, I think the very, very first thing I'd do would be thinking about inventing a Fluent device for my brand. The evidence is so strong, but can you explain what a Fluent device is and what the evidence, what does the data tell us about how effective it is?
Yeah, well, it was a term I coined, some years ago now, to describe a repeatedly used character through a long-running campaign. So think the M&M's characters, or Geico Gecko, or the meerkats in Compare the Market, or a sort of human scenario that's repeated in different ways, like Should Have Gone to Specsavers, or Snickers. You're not you when you're hungry. Another good example. And those long-running devices are very good at getting people, I suppose, just to know instantly what they're seeing, but also to help improve processing fluency, which also helps to reduce price sensitivity, by the way, as well. So that is really effective over a long period, and you more like to create campaigns that result in profit gain and share gain as a result. And one of the things I often say is that, there's been a lot of focus in recent years from the marketing sciences on shapes, fonts, colors, logos, and being consistent, all important things. But these are things that don't live. They are signs and symbols for the left hemisphere. So if you're creating advertising where you're trying to capture and hold attention, where you're trying to put things in memory through emotional response, it's the living that you need to put at the heart of your assets. Create living assets, characters that move, scenarios where people are, doing something that's familiar, a social context for the right hemisphere to decode, understand, and enjoy. That is an important way of producing profitable work. And that Fluent device, as I show in Lemon, has also been disappearing, in recent years. But I think that too, a bit like humour, I think people are alive to the possibility again and creating them where they can. Anecdotally, I hear this.
And what a competitive advantage as well, because, chances are your competitors are not doing that particularly well. Yeah. And you could be. Yeah. One of my favourite examples in your book is Yorkshire tea. You've got the accent, you've got where things are done proper. Even the idea is kind of fluent.
Exaggeration to extreme lengths.
Characters, the scene, use of famous Yorkshire people.
Yes.
Done incredibly well.
Yes, absolutely. The late Michael.
We should, of course, acknowledge Michael Parkinson.
Michael Parkinson, yes, a brilliant spot. Yeah. So no, absolutely, that's a fantastic example. And also, when you think of the Sean Bean example in particular, with the drawing of the sword, moto azione, right there, isn't it? That turning point. What's happening if I'm looking around, awkwardly, what's happening here? That's a great example of it.
Brilliant example. Well, talking of advertising, you and I were just chatting, weren't we, about having a little catch up on the latest and greatest ads, and looking at them through your expert's eyes. Given that you've literally written the book on it, and you've done a lot of two. Yeah, you've written both books. In fact, tell me what the endorsement you got for your book was.
Which one?
The look out. Which one he says? Yeah.
I don't know. So
no, I mean, it's so good that when you pick it up.
Yes. No. That was my little joke.
Was that? Oh, so your joke?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, my little joke was that it was actually someone said this at DDB in New York many years ago about their internal company manual, but they said it's the kind of book that. Once you put it down, you just can't pick it back up again. And so it's not like that, by the way. It is quite an enjoyable read, I've been told. I can confirm. Now, for anyone watching on YouTube, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, here it is. Yes. Look out here. Maybe I should go this way around to show you just how thick it is. There's plenty.
We're almost talking telephone directory. Depends on which postcode you're in, of course.
Yes.
But kind of think telephone directory. But the most beautifully presented and produced book, and I think you managed to use up Europe's supply of pearlescent paper.
Yeah, and all credit to the IPA and the designer who did it. But it's a nice piece.
So I was thinking, okay, for our section on advertising and the best ads of the last few weeks, we wouldn't be Fluent if we didn't have a jingle or some music to intro it. You see,
yes.
Now I've used obviously a slight rip-off of the Sex Pistols to introduce the podcast.
Yeah.
This is your section.
Yeah.
As we're going to be talking about adverts that you think are good.
Yeah.
What would be your soundtrack?
Oh, I think we'd go for something very silly like Boccherini's string quartet.
I knew you'd say something like that. I do Sex Pistols. You do what? 17th century classical musician.
Play to your characters. Yeah.
Brilliant. Right, we'll have to dub that in when we do the
personality is very important. In fact, Bill Bernbach said something similar. He said, personality. Without personality, a brand, a person, or a product for that matter, won't succeed. So, lean in to your Sex
indeed.
Pistols.
Okay, well, right. Okay, well, we'll edit that into this part of the conversation. So, tell me an advert you've seen recently that has impressed you.
Well, we've talked about a few already, but there's an advert for Twix, which is quite nice at the moment, and it's two guys dressed identically in the forest, sitting on a log, cracking open the Twix, describing how they like, left or right, doesn't really matter. They're both great, and then you sort of step back and you see two bears behind, bear costumes. I mean, wonderfully silly. And they're talking about, it doesn't matter whether it's left or right, referring to the two guys sitting on the log. They both taste as good, and that the bears talk about how they love the crunch, and so I think it's quite nice. It's sort of got that visual repetition and that French might call mise en abîme. It's sort of like a hall of mirrors, reflecting into the distance. And again, how repetition leads to humour. And there's repetition within the ad too, because the bears repeat basically what the guys are saying. But it all demonstrates the Twixes, it talks about the Twix. The Twix is very clear that it's about Twix, and talks about, I guess the magic in the product. And slightly ironically, it also does your left and right brain, because the two guys are focused in on the Twix. It's this narrow beam. The narrow beam. Narrow beams on the Twix. Yeah. Broad beam, there's two bears going. That's often a very very productive line of humour. It's this sort of looking at things up close, and not being aware of what's going on around. Mr. Magoo, for instance, will be a similar way, or the Specsavers campaign. It's sort of, I'm sort of too focused on this to really see the bigger picture. Yeah. Often a rich seam of humour. Now, I thought for my pick, I'm going to pick a McDonald's ad. Oh, okay. This is Wieden Kennedy from the US.
and they've partnered with Disney to pick out all the iconic scenes from many films where McDonald's is shown. What struck me about it was just how many, well, back to your Fluent devices point is, I mean, you know, you've got obviously Archers in there, but you've got Big Macs and Filet-O-Fish, you've got McFlurries and McNuggets. I mean, you suddenly realise quite how many reference points there are to having a McDonald's. And there's humour in there. There's a lovely twist at the end. Yeah. There's kind of a beautiful classical soundtrack kind of playing throughout. But what I thought was amazing about the System 1 test on it is I mean, you'll know this better than me, how rare it is for 100% of the audience to be able to recognise you from the beginning. This smashed it. I mean, absolutely smashed it. So everybody knew it was McDonald's. And so not only was emotion high throughout, but also everyone was knew exactly who was being advertised.
I mean, it's a brand that has embedded itself in culture, isn't it? Yeah. So it's become part of culture. So it's in so many films, you know, and not only that, but as you say, the products are referenced in those films as well. The product names are referenced, the McFlurry or whatever else. So yeah, I mean, it's a nice spot.
Yeah, brilliant example. I thought I'd add a sneaky third one in for our chat as well, only because it gives me a chance to get on my high horse about something. But our friends at Sky recently in fact, last week made Turkey of the Week. They had a lovely
Turkey of the Week according to
campaign. Sorry, campaign's Turkey of the Week.
Campaigns.
Now, listeners and viewers may remember a couple of years ago, they dropped it about 3 years ago, didn't they? There was quite a concerted pushback, and they've recently brought it back. And what was interesting, because of client confidentiality, I can't even say that. Yeah, NDAs, all that kind of thing. I can't say whether or not we work with Sky.
No,
and I can't say whether this was the best test that they've achieved.
No.
In that particular category, and I also can't say whether it led to record audiences, the biggest record audience ever watching Sky Sports. I can't say any of that. So whatever I do, I cannot say that. I can't confirm or deny. No. So let's put that to one side. But it was a genuinely really good ad. And I think that the point I wanted to kind of put to you was, you know, this shows the importance of remembering you are not the audience, right? Because our great friends at Campaign, who, you know, very smart people, they know and love the industry, write about it all the time. They can look at an ad and go, yeah, it's not very good, when in fact the public for whom it's designed think it's great. You know, it had, you know, talk about cultural references. Yeah, The Greatest Showman was the kind of creative concept. Yes. They were very well known. So Idris Elba was the kind of character throughout. Lots of dancing, lots of interaction, all the kind of stuff you talk, movement.
No, of course.
You had music, you had kind of knowing glances, you know, it had it all really. And it brilliantly demonstrated what Sky Sports is all about, which is a diversity and celebration of every kind of different sport and sportsmen, sportswomen, all succeeding at the various things. I thought it was fantastic. Yeah. But it does reveal something about our industry, which is we're not very good at recognizing advertising that actually works.
No, it's you know what this disconnect that others have written about between the advertising industry, and certainly commentators in the industry and the general public. So helpful, perhaps, to test or at least to research.
This is sort of why we're in business, actually, isn't it?
Yes,
maybe we should be thanking Campaign, because it's like, dear Campaign, thank you for keeping us in business.
You know, it helps to triangulate with the people who are going to watch it. You know, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
You're talking to.
It does indeed. So I wanted to wrap up by asking about your course. So you hinted at it at the beginning. You've got some grand plans in the making.
I have.
We talked about McGilchrist, and he features.
He will. He kindly had a chat with me, and so that's all going to be part of the course. And it's going to be a series of films. And very excited about it. And it's in the works, as it were. And if you're interested in knowing more, or at least pre-registering, you can go to orlandonadvertising.com. And that's not the title of the course, but it's the website. And if you go to that, you'll be able to pre-register, and you'll be among the first to know, when it all goes live. So do
great. And just for context, why create the course in the first place? And secondly, what will people expect to gain from doing the course with you?
So it's really made for marketing teams. marketing teams who want to know how to get the most out of their creative and the space that they buy, really. And it's going to look at many of the things in the books, but other things too. It goes much further than that. We talk about creating advertising in a digital age. We're going to look at the brain and underpin it with the brain. We're going to talk about lessons that I think we've forgotten in some ways about how to stand out. So there's going to be I can't give too much away, but there's a lot in there which I think you might enjoy and find useful. And I think it's, when it comes out, I look forward to hearing feedback from it.
I mean, I know I always have to caveat when I say this, like, I know I'm paid to say this, but genuinely, your book, Look Out, and Lemon before it is a masterclass at uncovering how my advertising works. Yeah. But what you've done is you've explained the kind of how, the mechanics of how, as well as the reasons, you've brought the how it works. It takes what is quite profound, the history of art and neuroscience, all those sort of things, but it very practically breaks it down into the tools that you can apply yourself to make advertising more effective.
And that's what the course will be: a practical guide, a series of films, each of which will have several important principles, and it's got to be about principles rather than technique, as it were. It's sort of, what the general things that you need to remember or at least not forget, rather than a kind of code that you need, and opportunity also for you to, I suppose, work at it yourself. So
sounds very exciting. OrlandoandAdvertising.com.
That's the website that you can pre-register on. Yeah. But that's not the name of the course.
We'll go check it out. There you go. And the name of the course will be revealed at some point in the future. All to be revealed. Yeah. Brilliant. Orlando, thank you so much. As ever, fascinating conversation. Absolute really pleasure. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, and we should do this again.
We should. We might even do it.
Let's do that.
Coming to you soon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to the Uncensored CMO. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to never miss an episode again, you know what to do. Go to wherever you get your podcasts, hit subscribe, or if you want to watch the episode, go over to my YouTube channel where you can find me at Uncensored CMO, and again, hit subscribe there. If you want to follow me, I'm over at LinkedIn, John Evans, or on Twitter at Uncensored CMO. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure. See you next time.